Welcome to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. There are no traffic jams along the Extra Mile when you're studying for your bar exam. And now, your host, Jackson Mummy, owner of the Celebration Bar Review.
Everybody, welcome to episode 270 of the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. This is your host, Jackson Mummy. Glad to be with you. We've survived the non-hurricane of Dorian. And boy, what a crazy month it's been, and we're just starting out, and here we are, ready to roll. Bar results have been coming out for a few days now, starting the season of results from July 2019 exam. We're going to talk a little bit about those results and some early information that we have. And we know that the Florida bar results should be coming out next week, so in our next episode, we'll be talking about those. If this is your first time on the podcast with us, I want to welcome you. We're glad that you found us. We are excited to have you with us. We talk all things bar exam related every week, and you can watch or listen to these podcasts. It's your choice. If you prefer to watch the podcast, you can do that by going to celebrationbarreview.com/270. That's the episode number, 270. If you prefer to listen to your podcast, you can do that on Apple Podcasts or on iTunes Radio or radio.com or Spotify or lots of other places the podcasts are syndicated. And then we also have a complete archive of all of our episodes. I'm a little stunned when I look at the episode number, 270 of these that we've done over the past 4 or 5 years. And you can find all of these podcast episodes on our website. Click under case studies and you'll see a link to the podcast. So lots of different ways to get your podcast information. Well, in today's episode, what I want to do is really kind of a mashup of a couple of different things. First, I want to talk about the result information that we have as of this moment. I delayed in recording this episode so I could get some information from the early results that came out right after Labor Day. And then I want to give you a brief excerpt talking about some myths about the bar exam, because this is myth season. This is when those happy, smiling, very excited 1Ls walk into law schools all across the country, get all excited about the hairy hand case and contracts and Palsgraf and torts and whatever else they're studying. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, they come across a desk. At least when I was in law school, it was a table or a desk outside the cafeteria with some looming 3L sitting there who bellows at them, "You gotta sign up for a bar review if you're ever gonna pass the bar." And these poor kids, because they are generally, at least academically children, go, "Okay, sure, I'll do that." And they sign up for a bar review in their first year of law school with no idea what they're doing and getting all their information from a 3L who actually knows very little about the process as well. And then they're surprised when things don't turn out so well years later. There's so much mythology about the bar exam out there. And if you're a regular listener and watcher of these podcasts, you know that I rail against this on a regular basis. So instead of doing a new rant today, I thought what I'd do actually would be to take a brief excerpt from our free webinar that we produce called Do Something Different, Make the Next Bar Exam Your Last Bar Exam. And I thought I would take just a brief part of that webinar and share it with you today about 3 myths that get in your way of passing the bar. Now, this is just a brief bit of the webinar that we do, and I want to let you know about the full webinar. The webinar is offered on demand, so you can watch it right away. All you have to do is go to celebrationbarreview.com/webinar. There's also a registration button here on the show notes page in either the audio or the video version of the podcast. Now, during this free webinar, what I'm going to do is lead you through the 4 steps that successful bar takers follow. I'll also be using a lot of case studies. You'll be hearing from successful students in their own words. We've got some great video clips of many of them talking about what they did. But the basic premise of the training is that you can't do the same old thing. You can't just follow the crowd, and you can't be successful by doing the same things you did in law school. And so in this excerpt that we're going to use today, I'm going to share with you 3 things that I think can be mistakes, killer mistakes for people. And I think you're going to find that interesting. But we'd love to have you on the full webinar. It's filled with great information. It is chock full of information that you can use right away. And there are also some great offers if you're thinking about a bar review. So I encourage you, stick around for today's podcast, get a sample of the webinar, and then sign up to attend this completely free training, again, called Do Something Different, Make the Next Bar Exam Your Last Bar Exam. But before we get to that, I want to turn our attention for a few minutes on the latest news around the bar exam and what's been going on. Let me start by just telling you some states that have released results as we're recording today. We have received results from Indiana, from Kansas, from New Mexico, North Dakota, Oklahoma, and West Virginia. So all very small states. A few of those states are UBE states, that's Uniform Bar Exam states. A couple of them are not. Indiana is not a UBE jurisdiction. Kansas and New Mexico, North Dakota, and are UBE, as is West Virginia, and Oklahoma is not. So that's what we've got in terms of results coming out. Now that's a very small sample size, and it doesn't really tell us a great deal, except that it opens the gates to get the actual official statistics from the National Conference of Bar Examiners. And that's really where I want to spend the bulk of my time here. What we've learned with the release of the first set of results is what the July 2019 multi-state bar exam, the MBE, what those scores will be. The National Conference already has all of those numbers. They had to compile all of the multi-state results across the country, even though in some states like California or Georgia, you won't get your results until later in November. The National Conference already has scored your multi-state exam. And so we know some things about the multi-state score. Now, the first thing, and what's going to be the headline, I think, for most people, is that the mean score, the average score for July 2019 was 141.1. That's a scaled score out of 200. Now, that's good news. It's an increase of 1.6 mean points from the July 2018 mean. So if we're comparing July to July, and July bar results are always higher, and I'll explain why in a moment, it's an increase from 139.5 to 141.1. Now you might say 1.6 points. I mean, what does that mean? Is it significant? The answer is yeah, it is probably pretty significant. It's the largest increase compared to the previous July's mean, going back more than 10 years to July 2008. So typically what we see is a very small change, historically relatively small change, or a drop. Now, if we're going back to the July MBE scaled score, mean scaled score, if we go back to 2015, that score was 139.9. Then it went up slightly to 140.3 in 2016, went up again to 141.7 in 2017. We thought, hey, maybe we're breaking through here. And then in 2018, the bottom fell out. We dropped to 139.5. Now we're back up to 141.1. So still not as high as we were 2 years ago, but at least we're moving in the right direction. And that's good news. And I don't want to, count that as anything but. Whenever we see those numbers move up, that's good news, and we should be excited about that. Now, the good news, however, is tempered by some other news and kind of burying the lead, I think. The National Conference reports, and we'll put the link in our show notes to this, but while the MBE mean score increased for all of the examinee groups in July 2019, they say, well, there was one group where it didn't go up, and this is sort of the exception proving the rule. Repeaters of the bar exam, no matter how many times they had taken it, but if you had taken and failed, then that group did not have an increase in their MBE score. Now, that's significant because the primary audience that we talk to here at Celebration Bar Review are people who have not passed their bar exam. And we've got plenty of first-time takers, don't get me wrong, but our real focus is on those who are retaking the exam. That's why our webinar is titled Do Something Different. And I think this really makes clear that point, that if you are a repeat bar taker and you hear the MBE score went up, well, that might make you feel better. Statistically, it didn't go up for your group. That group did not have an increase in their MBE score. And I think that that is significant and something to be concerned about. You might say, well, why would that be happening? I think the basic reason is that most people that repeat the bar just keep doing the same thing over and over again. And the result of that is that their scores actually decrease. They rarely go up significantly. And so if you're in that cycle of having taken and failed the exam, or if you fail the July 2019 exam when your results come out, one of the most important things for you to keep in mind is that you simply can't do the same thing. You've got to take a different approach. Statistically, the odds are against you, as you know already, but they will be much greater against you if you keep doing the same thing. So I think it's important to understand that while the numbers have gone up, they've gone up for a different cohort. So how significant is that cohort? Well, one of the reasons that July bar results are higher than February results is the mixture of applicants. In the July bar exam, in July 2019, 65% of the bar takers were first-time takers. And that left us with about 23% being repeat bar takers based on the national conference's statistics. And they caveat that by saying we're not entirely sure of those numbers, but based on what they think a repeat bar taker is. Now that 65-23% with some 2%, I guess, that can not be accounted for. That is a heavily skewed first-time taker rate. That's your traditional law school student coming out, first-time taker, coming from a traditional law school background. Now, don't misunderstand that number. That doesn't mean there's a 65% pass rate. I think we'll still see a pass rate that's just barely over 50%. Now, when we get to the February exam, the percentages almost totally flip. You have far more repeat bar takers than you have first-time bar takers, and the pass rate for repeat bar takers is much, much lower, typically anywhere from 20 to 30%, and so the overall number drops dramatically. In February of 2019, we were looking at a 54% overall pass rate. Now, we don't have an overall pass rate yet for July 2019. When that's produced later in the year, we'll share that with you. But I think it's significant to understand that the exam in July is not an easier test. It just has a different mix of people taking the exam. If you're a repeat bar taker, you're really competing against other repeat bar takers for that passing group, 20, 25, 30, 35%, whatever it might be. And so one of the keys for you is to get started early, jump in and get your studies underway, and then do something different. You notice the theme here, in order to get the advantage of moving your score up. So when you're hearing about this increase in the MBE, while that's good news, it's mostly good news for first-time bar takers from traditional law schools. It's less good news for almost everybody else. And if you're a repeat bar taker, there was no good news for you at all. Yeah, thanks, Jackson. That's great. Way to make my morning, right? But that's the reality. Now, what about the number of people taking the exam? Well, I thought this was interesting. The number of bar takers went up slightly from 2018 in the July exam. We're up to about 45,000 bar takers nationally in 2019. That is a decrease. In 2015, we were at 48,000. So we're seeing a decrease in the number of bar takers. I think that one of the reasons for this, quite frankly, is a fair number of people get discouraged and just give up. Some of them choose to not go to law school. A few of them choose to start their own reality TV shows, but you get the idea. In general, we've got fewer people taking the exam. I think that makes for an even more competitive market for repeat bar takers. Now, I think all of this begs the question that many of you might be asking, which is, if I'm a repeat bar taker, should I skip the July exam? Should I take July instead of February? The answer to all of that is no. Ignore it. It doesn't really matter for your purposes. As long as you're doing your work and you're preparing in a way that's productive, the test is the same. It's not a harder test in July or an easier test in February or vice versa. Test is the same. The results, again, are only skewed by who's taking it. So don't let that throw you. If you don't feel like you can be ready in February of 2020, then you can sign up with a course like ours now and start your studies for July 2020. And I'm talking to lots of people every day right now who are planning to do that. So plenty of time to get started and to be successful for those exams. Again, really want to encourage you to get underway as soon as you can. All right, well, that's what we know right now about the multi-state score. Now, the next big jurisdiction, in fact, the first big jurisdiction that will release their results will be Florida. Those will come out and we'll hold off on our podcast, recording our podcast episode until right after the results come out on Monday, I want to say the 16th of September. And that's usually a big bellwether in terms of what's going to happen nationally. So we want to pay particular attention to that. If you're in one of these states where results will be coming out in the next few days, good luck to you. We wish you well. We've got a number of states that will be reporting in addition to Florida, and we know that that's always a time of great anxiety for everyone. If you find out that you did not pass your exam, I want to encourage you to contact us. We offer a free consultation to talk about results, and you'll see the link on the show notes page. Encourage you to sign up for one of those conferences to talk with me, talk about what we can do to help you make the next bar exam your last bar exam. But one of the things that we're going to tell you when we have that conversation is the importance of doing things differently, as you've heard, but also to not fall into the traps or the myths that can occur around the bar. And as I said, there are at least 3 big myths that we see that really cause difficulties for bar takers, particularly people who are repeating. And so what I want to do is to give you a brief excerpt of our upcoming webinar in which we talk about those 3 myths and why they can be so dangerous. So let's go ahead and jump into this piece of our webinar. Do something different, make the next bar exam your last bar exam. Look at destination. We're going to break it down into what I call 3 myths. There are 3 myths about the bar exam that are pernicious and they're pervasive. I can't think of another P, but there's got to be one somewhere out there. They're peculiar, perhaps, but they are myths that keep bar takers from being successful, and they're fed into your brains, your little 1L brains, my little 1L brain, right from the beginning, and they are absolutely untrue. And I can tell you that having worked for 30 years with literally tens of thousands of bar takers in every jurisdiction in the country except Louisiana, because they don't offer the multi-state or anything like it. But in 49 out of the 50 states, I can tell you that these 3 things that I'm going to share with you are myths. And if you're taking notes, I think you're going to want to write these down. The first myth that we've got to debunk is that in order to study and in order to be successful on the bar exam, you need to memorize. You know, if that were true, then really what a bar review should be is a memorization course. You should learn how to memorize because that's the most important skill. And yet anyone who's a lawyer in practice will tell you that memorization is absolutely not a skill at all. In fact, the reality of the bar exam is that it is a test of what you know and not a test of what you can recite. Now, this is critically important because if you're spending your time trying to memorize, if you're creating mnemonics and flashcards and songs to remember the mnemonics, if you're spending your time in lectures that are telling you mnemonic stories to help you remember the elements and the rules and to memorize, you're spending a lot of time, a huge amount of time, in fact, for very little return. You see, I can hold up this device on my wrist and ask it for the elements of any particular rule of law and get it in an instant. That's the world we live in today. It is no longer necessary to memorize. And the bar examiners know this. They're not interested in what you can memorize. And yet, students, particularly those coming out of the big box world, think that that's what they should be doing. And so they're all over focused on the memorization part of their work, when indeed they need to be focused on the application part. So if you bought into the myth that you must memorize to be successful, you're going to be less effective. Now, I know some of you will say, well, how do I learn if I don't memorize? We're going to show you a methodology that's been in existence for many, many years that replaces memorization and is, in fact, the preferred educational model in virtually every major college and university in the world today. All right, myth number 2 is that in addition to memorization, when you are writing and studying and preparing, that you should use the IRAC form of writing. Issue, rule, application, conclusion. You learned it the first couple of weeks of law school, and most of you had never heard of it before, and some of you now cling to it desperately as though it's the last ember leaving the Titanic. But the fact is that it is a myth as well. IRAC writing does not work, and here's why it doesn't work. The bar exam tests your ability actually to identify disputes and then show how the law is applied. It is not an issue spotting test. Issue spotting is great when you've been in one class for 18 or 36 weeks and the professor wants to know that you paid attention for that period of time. It's perfectly legitimate and justifiable that way. But the reality is that the bar examiners are not interested in that level of depth and detail, nor are they writing questions that are designed to be issue spotting questions. Instead, what they want to know is, can this new applicant actually take the skills that we've been talking about and that they've been learning and apply them in the real world? And so in order to do that, the examiners write questions that are built around conflicts or disputes. And then they ask you, how would the law be applied in order to reach a conclusion? Now, that's very different than issue spotting, talking about things that don't really matter in order to give yourself mythical points on an exam that doesn't reward it. It's a little bit like being a great dancer when you're in an audition show where the judges have their back turned to you and they're just listening to your voice, right? So the idea here is that you want to do what the examiners want. Now, I know that some of you will say, well, but everyone uses IRAC. That's true. And most people fail the bar exam. Let's keep going back to that. And so if IRAC writing by itself were the gold standard, we would expect far more than 50% of the people taking the bar who are all using IRAC writing to be successful. They're not. Well, is there an alternative to IRAC writing? Yes, absolutely. And we're going to show it to you in just a few minutes. The other part of IRAC writing that I think you've got to be aware of is this idea that somehow you can spot all the issues on a bar exam question. The reality is you can never spot every issue. And the reason for that is that the word issue itself is so undefined and general that there could always be another issue and another issue and another issue. That's one of the first tricks you learn as a law professor. There's always another issue. There's always another ball I can hide. And the reality of the bar exam is that if you were trying to spot issues, you're going to run out of time, you're going to run out of words, you're going to run out of energy. So instead of trying to spot an unending list of issues, most of which are not important, we want you to focus instead on disputes and conflicts. And that's what the practice of law is. You can imagine showing up in court one day and saying, Your Honor, I know we've got a case here, a contract case, and I know it's set for a one-day trial, but I actually need 5 days. And the judge says, why do you need 5 days, counselor? And you say, well, I've got to go through all of the issues in this case. I want to spot all the issues. And the judge says, no, I don't think so. What's this dispute about? Well, it's actually about whether or not there was a breach. Great. Do we need to talk about formation of the contract and all the issues that might be there? Probably not. That's the world the bar examiners live in every jurisdiction. And if you've been an issue spotter IRAC writer, you may have been the very best issue spotter IRAC writer out there, and that is absolutely no guarantee of success on the bar exam. And so if you've been frustrated because you've been doing that, this is one of the reasons why. It's a myth that this is what you should be doing. All right. The third myth that I think is absolutely vital to understand is the myth that somehow you can work your way through this. You can use brute force. You can be the Hulk. You can absolutely smash the bar exam. In fact, I think that's probably the motto of a company. Smash the bar, right? You know, crush the bar. Really? I don't think so. That's not what the test is really about. And yet I know many people believe that they can do that. They can overwork or outwork or somehow hustle the bar. Well, the truth is you can't beat the exam at all. The reason for this is that you can never learn all of the testable law. There's just simply too much. And it's constantly evolving and changing and being added to. And so no one has that capacity. I've yet to meet anyone who can memorize and learn and know all of the law. In fact, law school professors will tell you immediately that while they might know some part of their particular favorite subject, they don't even know all the law in their own subject, much less the 14, 15, 19, 20 or more topics on the bar exam. Well, that would be pretty disappointing. If you thought that you had to brute force your way through the test, what are you supposed to do? Well, we use a technique called selective intuition, and combined with our writing approach, which we're going to call FLA, and I'll get to in a minute, and our learning approach, which we call spaced repetition, all three of those techniques together combine to defeat these myths. When you're using selective intuition, you're using your genius mind in order to find the right answers in multi-state, in essays that you would never have found if you had tried to outwork the exam. If you had spent thousands of hours studying, if you had spent hundreds of hours trying to memorize, if you had written hundreds of IRAC essays, you still wouldn't have the success that you need to be a passing bar taker. So there's bad news here. The bad news is there's mythology. The good news is you now know what the myths are. And the better news is there's a way around each of those myths. I've piqued your interest and made you curious about what else is in this webinar. It's filled with lots of great information. I hope that this gave you a feeling for that and a sample of it. But more importantly, I hope that you learned something about some of these myths. And if you're intrigued by that, if you want to know more about why they're myths and what we do to resolve those myths, I encourage you again to join us for Do Something Different, Make the Next Bar Exam your last bar exam. Registration is entirely free. You do need to register and then set the date and time that you want to participate. And you can do that here in the show notes or by going to celebrationbarreview.com/webinar. All right, well, that's it for this week. I hope everybody has a great week. Good luck to those of you waiting for results. For those of you who got results and they weren't favorable, don't forget to contact me. I'd love to talk with you and see if we can figure out a path to success for you. And we will be back again next week and let you know what's going on in the world of bar review and along the extra mile.
Thanks for listening to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers at www.celebrationbarreview.com.